Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be with all of you for this conversation in our ongoing series on faith and culture. And we're deeply grateful to be joined by a distinguished member of our faculty, Carolyn Forché. Carolyn, thank you for joining us today. For 11 years now, we've gathered for this faith and culture series under the leadership of Paul Elie, who serves as a senior fellow at our Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And Paul, we're grateful to you and to our Berkley Center for providing these moments for us to be together. I'd like to express my gratitude to our Office of Mission and Ministry, which has partnered with us on this Jesuit Heritage Month lecture as we remember this week the 30th anniversary of the Jesuit martyrs in El Salvador. Father David Hollenbach, a member of our faculty, a senior fellow at our Berkley Center, who's with us today, will join Paul and Carolyn during their conversation to share his reflections on the context of this remembrance. Over the course of the past decade, we've had the privilege of welcoming a number of authors and artists, scholars to the Hilltop, individuals whose work explores the intersection of religion, art, literature, and society, from Colin McCann and Martin Scorsese to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, earlier this semester, Sister Helen Prejean. When we launched this series in April 2008, Paul offered the opening lecture that reflected on Flannery O'Connor's lecture entitled The Catholic Novelist in the Protestant South, which was her final public address, which she presented here at Georgetown in October of 1963. In that address, Flannery O'Connor sought to define a new vision for Catholic literature, saying, and I quote, "In the novelist's case, prophecy is a matter of seeing near things with their extensions of meaning, and thus of seeing far things close up," close quote. Well, there's perhaps no one more capable than Carolyn Forché of enabling us to see far things close up, to explore, in her words, a poetry of witness. Carolyn tells us, quote, "When poetry is read as witness, the poem is judged by its truth as a poem and what this truth does in the reader." This is what she sought to capture in a 1993 edited work, Against Forgetting, which she edited and compiled, and it is the spirit that permeates her new work. What you have heard is true, a memoir of witness and resistance. While her travels have taken her around the world, from Beirut to South Africa, her memoir focuses on her time as a young adult in El Salvador in 1978. What You've Heard is True is a finalist for the National Book Award. The award ceremony will be just a little later this week in New York, and we're very proud of Carolyn for her nomination. Over the course of her career, her writings have documented, motivated, articulated our shared humanity, even in the darkest and most troubled places. An acclaimed poet, author of 4 books of poetry, she is also a gifted translator, teacher, activist. In 1998, she was presented with the Adita and Ira Morris Hiroshima Foundation Award for Peace and Culture. She's received a Guggenheim Fellowship, multiple fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts. Her first collection of poetry, Gathering the Tribes, received the Yale Younger Poets Award. Her 5th, In the Lateness of the World, is due to be published next spring. She's university professor in our Department of English and previously served as director of our Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice. And we're honored to have Carolyn here today and to join her in conversation with Paul Elie, who, in addition to serving as a senior fellow at our Berkley Center, Paul's the author of The Life You Save May Be Your Own, which won the Penn Martha Allbrand Award for first nonfiction. He also is the author of Reinventing Bach. His essays appear in The Atlantic, The New York Times, The New Yorker, Vanity Fair, Commonweal. This past April, he published in The New Yorker on the crisis facing the Catholic Church, and a year ago, a long-form article in The Atlantic on the canonization of Oscar Romero. And prior to his time at Georgetown, Paul worked for 2 decades in book publishing, for many years as a senior editor at Farrar, Straus and Giroux. So Paul and Carolyn, I want to thank you both for your presence. I know I share with everyone here how much we look forward to your conversation. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, President DeGioia. Thank you to Jerry Hayes and other members of the Jesuit community for opening the Jesuit Heritage Month at this event. And thank you especially to David, who will join us in a little while. And thank you very much, Carolyn, for joining us for this event. In some ways, I've looked forward to having this conversation with you as a colleague for years and didn't expect that it would take place this way. But what better way? I can't imagine a better way than to do it than this. One of the pretexts for the event is the 30th anniversary of the murder of 6 Jesuits in El Salvador, along with a woman who worked as their housekeeper and her daughter. So before we begin, I'd just like to read their names into the record one more time. Ignacio Elie, Ignacio Martin Barro, Segundo Montes, Juan Ramon Moreno, Joaquin Lopez y Lopez, Armando Lopez, Elbo Ramos, Selena Ramos. Rest in peace. That was a very dark day in the history of El Salvador, of the hemisphere. It's your witness to those dark days that runs through your work. I've asked you to open the conversation by reading your account from the new book of a particularly dark day that you witnessed in El Salvador.
We were somewhere near the unfinished cathedral and the plaza, where for a few hours in the afternoons and also at night, vendors sold holy cards, ice cream, and open sodas from stalls that closed with rippled security gates. I was with Monsignor Ricardo Uriaste, a quiet, studious priest whom I knew as a friend of Monsignor Romero's. He was walking calmly but with long steps, and I walked beside him, but it was hard to keep up. The weather was white with the coming rains. We had been talking about the views of the religious community toward the armed struggle when suddenly he fell silent, holding his hand out before him, palm down. He had stopped walking and had fixed his gaze on the street ahead of us. I tried to see what he was seeing, but saw only the traffic, bumper to bumper, brightly painted buses with their black exhaust and sacks tied to their roofs, cars nosing behind them with windows down and radios blaring. The voice in the commercial was calling out, "Domingo, Domingo, Domingo." Then the horns, voices, and motor scooters died down. The cars had stopped too, many of the drivers now seeing what Monsignor Uriaste saw. A panel truck had stopped just ahead of us in the street, and men were leaping from the back. 2 of them grabbed a teenager wearing a student's rucksack and wrestled him into the vehicle. Everyone stopped or moved away from where they had been, some ducking behind the buses, and right beside me, a security gate was suddenly slammed into the sidewalk. Monsignor Uriaste crossed himself as others around us vanished into alleys and shops. There was a stillness then, and the truck peeled away with such a scream of tires that the sound seemed to stay in the air after it could no longer be seen. "We must pray for that boy," Monsignor Uriaste whispered. This was the first and only time I witnessed an abduction, the moment when someone is made to disappear, to become desaparecido. Before and after this, I encountered the desaparecidos only in the body dumps, in the morgue, on the roadside, and along the beach. Or I would study their faces in the photographs provided by their families and ask, sometimes aloud, "Where are you?" Over the years, these faces have grown younger and younger.
That's an extraordinarily vivid passage. Nearly 40 years ago that took place. How does that memory, if I could call it that, how does that exist in your imagination? Do you have to recall it? Is it right there at hand? Is there some reconstruction involved? What?
Well, This book begins more or less in the autumn of 1977, and most of the book takes place in the 2 years following that. And they're the most vivid 2 years of my life. I have a strange, very indelible memory of it. But in writing it, it wasn't enough to remember it. I had to go through it again. I had to relive it, to remember it in precise terms. So that made it a bit difficult to accomplish, which might be why it took 15 years to write it. I kept stopping and not wanting to go any further, not wanting to write certain scenes. So I procrastinated a lot. That was one thing that happened. But yeah, I had to go through it again.
And what was it like to go through it compared to what you felt the first time? You felt something different, or?
Well, the first time I was 27 years old. I was very young, and I was a young 27, I think, in a lot of ways. And so, and I was seeing that world for the first time. I was seeing a manifestation of evil for the first time. I saw a saint for the first time. All of this happened when I was young. And so when I was recalling it, I'm a much older person because I waited 23 years to even begin writing this. So it's really took its time, partly because I didn't feel prepared to write it, at first. It took a long time for this experience to mature within me and for me to understand, not really understand it, but have a perspective on what happened and have some glimpse into who I was at the time, and to see her from a distance, to have a perspective on her too, and all her foolishness and because I was actually I was terrified often in El Salvador, really terrified, and so when people ask me why I stayed anyway, I have a couple of answers that I give, but part of me can't answer that, My older self, I would sometimes be typing and I'd be thinking, what were you thinking, Carolyn? Why did you do that? And answering those questions was difficult too.
I'm sure it was, and for the people around you and people at the college where you were teaching, but the effect on the reader, on this reader anyway, isn't that at all. You've laid out that this is in some ways your chance, that you've known from childhood about that evil exists, that people suffer, that there's a need for a human response to that, and suddenly and we'll go back to that, I hope, but you then walk into a situation in which the things that you've known since childhood are happening right before your eyes. And I know as a reader, I thought this is exactly where you belong, or you made me feel that way.
Thank you, I hope. I feel that way about it now. When Leonel came to my door, I was correcting papers. I was teaching 4 sections of freshman composition, and they were very large classes, so I was always grading papers, and I was alone at the time, and I had spent the previous summer translating the poetry of Claribel Alegría in Spain. Her daughter was one of my best friends. We had decided to do this translation together, even though neither of us had ever translated anything before, much less poetry. And I had the mistaken notion that I would only need the very thick Spanish-English dictionary and the 500 verbs, conjugations. But that wasn't my problem with Claribel's poetry. My problem was that she had grown up in El Salvador under military dictatorship and all that implied. And so I struggled with the poems. I struggled to differentiate literal from figurative meaning. And so Maya took me to her mother's house in Spain for the summer and said, Mommy will explain everything, which Mommy tried to do. But I learned a great deal that summer. It was really an inspiring summer, also a depressing one, because writers from all over Latin America were coming through Spain at the time. Franco had just died. And Clarivella had a house, and they would come and stay with her for a while they were resettling, fleeing the dirty wars in Chile and Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, many of them from the Southern Cone. And I would, sit at their feet and listen to them talking in the afternoons. They would have these discussions about politics and literature, and what I was hearing was horrific. And I slowly came to realize that my own government was supporting those military dictatorships. And that was something I took back home with me to California, joined Amnesty International, started writing letters, wanted to do something, didn't know what, and I'm home alone and the doorbell rings. You shouldn't really start a book with the doorbell rings, because it's so I started with another scene instead, but it's what happened, so I had to write the doorbell. And at first I didn't want to open the door, because I didn't know who it was, and there were El Salvador license plates, and I'd heard a lot about El Salvador, but my curiosity got me. And so the book begins with this visitor who's predicting war in El Salvador in 3 to 5 years. And what does he want? He wants a poet to come to El Salvador right now, because it's very important for a poet to see this right now. That's when I started wondering about him, because who would ever think of that? Who would ever want a poet, for anything? I tried to tell him, you have to understand how poets are viewed in the United States. And his idea was that this poet would learn all about the country, and then when the war began, the poet could explain it to the American people, so the American people would have a better sense of what was happening. So I explained that poets weren't consulted on foreign policy decision-making, and that we don't get to talk to the American people practically ever, except in small coffee houses, and we're viewed as a fringe element, in the society, kind of bohemian, unstable element, artistic, not at all to be consulted on matters of foreign policy. So he said, oh, that's too bad, because in Latin America, we take our poets very seriously. We either send them to diplomatic posts or we put them in prison, but we take them seriously. And I thought, this is not, oh, really? So he said, well, you're just going to have to change that. You're going to have to change what a poet is in the US. So there were a number of reasons why one could begin to doubt his proposal, that being one of them, his faith in poetry and in poets and their ability to change things at all. And so, but it was intriguing, and he was brilliant, and the 3 days went a long way to answering questions I'd had during the summer. And he assumed I would come. I don't know why. I think he assumed he was terribly convincing, and therefore, So I want to know your next questions, but really it was about saying yes. And I told after he stayed with me for 3 days and talked and talked and talked and talked. And he had his 2 little girls with him. And the only time he stopped talking was to take them to eat, take himself to eat. And by the end, he asked me a question no one had ever asked me before. People ask, when you're in college, they ask what you're majoring in, or they ask what you want your profession to be. He asked me what I had planned to do for the rest of humanity in my life. Since no one had ever asked me that, I didn't have a ready answer, but he was right about one thing. That was one of the buttons he could push in me. And he said, I'm offering you an opportunity, and you don't have to accept it, but it would help us if you could accept it. So after he left, I told all of my friends about him. And I tried to make him sound, fine. And my friends, to a person, did not think this was a good idea for my Guggenheim grant. They said I would get malaria, or they said, you don't know this man. You've only talked to him for 3 days. And even his cousin, Clarivella Alegría, which is how he found me, doesn't really know who he is. There were lots of rumors about him, He was a champion marksman. He was a champion motorcycle racer. He was a small coffee farmer. He he could be with the guerrillas, but many people think he's with the CIA. So nobody was resolving any of this, you know, so I couldn't get anyone to agree with me that I should go until one person from college said, "How many people have you asked?" And I said, "Everybody." And he said, "I think you want to go. And I think you're going to keep talking to people until someone thinks it's a good idea." He said, "So let me be that someone. I think you should go. Go." Yes. I got on the phone. I got my ticket. Yeah, that was it. I just needed one person.
This all unfolds in the book, and this character, Leonel Gomez, dominates the book and our apprehension of what's going on in El Salvador. And there are comic aspects to it that you're bringing out here, but part of the beauty of the book is the road not taken, that Leonel wants to suggest that Carolyn's young and we Americans are all young. Carolyn needs to be educated. We Americans all need to be educated. And it's all true, but that's not the movement of the book, really.
Right.
The way you go into the material is as someone who begins with this deeper intuition that the right question is the kind of Rilkean question, you know, you must change your life. Right. What are you going to do with it? Where did that come from? You described having nightmares about people being tortured when you were a girl, looking at Life magazine and asking your mother.
There was pictures of the Holocaust, of the camps, in 1955 in Look magazine. I found the magazine in a pile of Looks in the garage, you know, where such magazines wind up, and I opened it up, and my mother was making dinner. I'm the oldest of 7 children. You know, they were babies all around all the time, and I asked my mother to explain the photographs while she was stirring at the stove. And I was really young. It must have been, I mean, I think in my mind,
young enough to kind of look up at her while she was
yeah,
at
I had
the
to.
stove.
Oh yeah, I was definitely looking up at it. She looked at me and she said, "You're not supposed to have that. You're not supposed to see that, honey. Give that back to me." So I pressed, and she said, "Those are Nazis." What is a Nazi? She said, "I will tell you when you're older." Meaning I had to go get the magazine and hide it under my mattress and take it out all the time, and because, you know, it was a mystery.
That's so, to me, reflective of what, I mean, I wasn't around, I'm a little younger, but of what ran through the Catholic culture of America in that time. The church, on the one hand, was there reminding us of the existence of evil, of our weakness, our proneness to sin, and on the other was encouraging our parents to protect us from all this stuff and make sure that we didn't find out about it except for their way and at what time they deemed appropriate.
Well, Catholic parents, and I think most parents, we were raised by war veterans of World War II. Almost everyone's father had been in the war, and none of them talked about it, especially with us. So there was a silence in these households. They would sometimes refer to the war, often they referred to it, but they never told us about it. It was during the war or before the war or after the war, but never any information about it. So this was also something in our childhoods that, you know, and I think that their silence was to protect us. Partly. They didn't want us to know. And they thought they could start over and build a new life. And they thought that wouldn't happen again.
But I guess I think that, and it's not exclusive to Catholics, of course, but to be Catholic in that moment was to know that the post-war shiny world of prosperity and forward thought was not really the real world, and that some intuition about that is why you end up in San Salvador.
I think it was, and then of course I came of age. I went to college between 1968 and 1972. I majored in the anti-war movement. We all did, and so I knew that. But he confronts that too with me in an interesting way, and interrogates that. And he pushed that button too. He said, "How much did you know about Vietnam when you were out marching?" And I said, I probably didn't know very much at all, except that I wanted the war to end, and he said, "Would you like to see one from the beginning?" I didn't believe him, partly, and partly I thought, yes, I did want to. because of my history with that conflict. And I was a teenager during the Civil Rights Movement, which I think had a lot to do with why the anti-war movement grew so quickly, and because we were all teenagers watching the water cannons deployed against Black Americans who were marching for civil rights. I think those were all formative.
Right, this huge post-war baby boom generation.
Yeah.
Suddenly mass media, television, and magazines like Life and Look were putting this material in front of you, and you can see what's happening out there. And then when Leonel says to come to El Salvador, it's this time you get to see it firsthand and not mediated through television, through magazines, etc.
Right.
And then Leonel, who's such a character that when I learned that people in this room knew him, I was astonished. You know, wow. You know, originally I was impressed that you knew Oscar Romero, but I came away from the book impressed that others here knew Leonel Gomez. That's how well you succeeded in making him real to the reader in the book.
Thank you.
And what he does is introduces you to other people. Mm-hmm. And one was the Jesuit rector.
Padre Acharya, yeah. Well, I went to, Father Acharya was brilliant. He was, my friend Margarita, who was my closest woman friend in Salvador, she worked at La UCA, the Jesuit University, and she knew them very well, and she would take me to talk with Padre Acharya, and you know, everyone would joke that no one understood him because he was so above everyone intellectually, and he would try very hard to, you know, explain to us his concepts of praxis and his various ideas, and you know, and he was so brilliant. And so I had conversations with him primarily. I met some of the others, not all of them. You know, but he was formative for us. He was a guiding intellect among everyone who was working for human rights and social justice, and anyone working on behalf of the poor or allied with the poor in any profession. Teaching, nursing, anything. They were all labeled subversives, everyone. So, you know, everyone was eventually vulnerable to violent death or torture or disappearance. It wasn't just a few people, it was everyone. So anyone who, it was so easy to be, you know, to be fearful of the death squads. The period that I write about is the period we called the time of the death squads. This is before the war, actually. Nobody really can pinpoint exactly when the war started, but sometime after Monsignor Romero's assassination. So this book, my time in El Salvador in the period that I'm writing about mostly, ends 1 week before his assassination, when I had supper with him in the Divine Providence Hospital Convent. And I was informed by Leonel and Monsignor that I had to leave the next day, and I didn't want to do this. So I talk in the book about the conversation I had with Monsignor urging him to leave. And he said, my place is with my people now. He was aware, completely aware of the danger that he was in, and he said, and now your place is with yours. I'd never thought of myself as having a people. You know, we don't think in those terms. And
so the saint tells you that you have a people.
Yeah, saint tells you have a people, and then you have to go home. So, but Leonel was really close friends with Monsignor, something very few people knew until after both of them were dead. But
Leonel would always say that he wasn't religious.
I'm not religious.
I don't go to a church.
No. Never go to church, no. He said, I believe with my life. You know, I don't go to church. I would ask him all the time. He'd drop me off at the cathedral to go to Mass, and then I wait for you outside, he said. And I would go in. And, you know, he really wanted me to know Monsignor and to listen to him and to go and hear the homilies, but he wouldn't come with us.
Because of your work with Witness and because you thought in such a sustained way about witness, I trust your witness even more than I would otherwise. So when I read you testifying really that there was a special kind of light coming off Romero, silvery, coming from his eyes, his skin, even his fingernails, an emulsion of light such as sanctity bestows, I'm inclined to trust that. So can you tell us about what was it like to be in the presence of someone that you're saying there was a tangible aura of sanctity around him?
I didn't see that until the end, toward the end. I mean, I saw a wonderful, gentle, studious, somewhat theologically, doctrinally conservative man.
And he was hurried. He was always going somewhere.
He was always going somewhere, and he was, he wouldn't take any security guards. He drove himself around in this car, He wasn't self-protective at all. He wrote his homilies on a big IBM Selectric machine, which was practically the only object in his room. And
he lived with some nuns. And,
yeah, he had a little casita on the grounds of Divine Providence Hospital. Very tiny room, one single bed, cross on the wall. That's it. He didn't want to live in the bishop's house. So, but
sound familiar?
The time that I saw this thing I'm describing as his light, we were in an interview with a Venezuelan journalist, and it was going long, and Monsignor was very patient. He was answering all the questions, and the journalist sort of wanted, my impression was, the journalist was trying to trap him into making statements about the guerrillas. And Monsignor was very careful not to get involved with that. He saw his role as a shepherd. And so he was deftly sidestepping these pointed questions and keeping himself from being trapped. And he was tapping this Bible that he was carrying with him. It was like a King James Bible with leather cover or something, little small one, and he was just tapping it. And I looked at his fingernails, and I saw that he was sort of giving off this strange light, and it was on him, it was on his face, it was in his hair, it was in his eyes. I saw it during this interview, and then he still had it when he sat down at the table in the convent kitchen right after the interview. And I thought, I've never seen this before. I've never seen this before. And I thought, I think he's a saint. I think just came to my mind. A lot of people already thought he was, but I saw it. I saw his tranquility. I know he was scared. He said he was scared. He said his knees would wobble or turn to, his knees would shake when he was scared. And even standing at the altar, or he was afraid, and he was very fearful that morning, the morning he was killed. He was very depressed and fearful. And Madre Luz, who was the Mother General, the Mother Superior of the
Order of Divine Providence was the
right.
order that housed him, right?
Carmelites, and yes, and she said to him, "Don't worry, you're not going to die before your time." And he said, "Oh, yes, right. I'm not going to die before my time." So that calmed things down. You might think that it's illogical to have things calmed down by a statement like that, but she seemed to know what to do. She always knew what to do. She is the nun who crawled out after the gunfire, blasted through, we think amplified by the microphone on the altar, possibly, but it was very, very loud, and Monsignor fell backwards and had the altar cloth in his hand, and she said, she crawled, everyone else hid under the pews, and she just went right to Monsignor and held him, and so she was with him in his last moments, and she said he died a holy bishop. She was very moving, her account of it. She was also a saint, I believe, although she hasn't been recognized at all yet by the church in any official way, but I think she is.
Well, hearing you speak, I'm thinking of these men at various Vatican dicasteries who held up the canonization of Romero for a third of a century, and I wish that they could have heard what you just said. maybe we can at least make sure they hear it about Luis.
Yeah, this was all political. You know, the people of Salvador had pictures of him with halo around him in their houses long time ago. You know, he was already a saint for them. The Vatican was just confirming what they already knew, and as they already venerated him, you know. And it was strange because they finally did finish the cathedral, and the wealthier people would go to Mass in the cathedral upstairs. And I went, you know, going there, knowing Monsignor was there, buried there inside the cathedral. I went up into this fancy Mass, and someone saw how I was dressed and came up and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You want to go down to the Mass downstairs. You belong downstairs." So they helpfully showed me to the side to go down. And there was the sort of basement church where the Theology of Liberation Mass was in progress, and I finally found my right Mass. And there was where Monsignor's coffin was. His tomb was down there. And so, but the people knew, you know, they did know.
I'm hearing what you're doing as an active witness, right, for our eyes and ears, but I also am thinking of the very powerful expression that President Gioia read out about what poetry does to witness. How was it, and then I'll ask Father David to come up and join us, but how is it to do an active literary witness in prose and in a memoir, and is that a different challenge than the one you've done to this point in poetry?
Well, this is my first prose book. I'm 69 years old, you know, I mean, I'm not like a spring chicken or anything, but I know it took me a long time. It's kind of a lifetime work, but I had to learn how to write it because a prose work has to be structured, you know, it's a book-length thing. So I made a decision early on that I felt that I wanted to take the reader on this journey with me. And the reader would never know more than I knew at the time, because I was thinking of younger readers and the Salvadoran kids whose parents brought them here during the war to escape the war, who would come into my office at university and tell me about the war. My parents won't talk, something familiar to me from World War II. So what I wanted was to show these students what it was like to be young and to go through something like this and to have this formation and education. And so it had to be written that way. And then I found some notebooks that I had kept while I was there. And there are passages in the book that are titled Written in Pencil, because the notebooks are in pencil, but also because this language is very strange. It's not like my calm narrator writing voice in the book. They are rushed and no punctuation and intense, and they're just describing scenes there that were happening as they happened, and they were, some of them, really horrible. So I decided to put them intact, verbatim, into the book and label them all written in pencil to alert the reader that this kind of language is different. And for me, it seemed to reflect the condition of extremity more than a calm narrating voice would. You know, that, so there are very few appearances of the woman in her 60s writing this in the book. She doesn't come and explain what's happening or meditate on events. She doesn't get an appearance until the very end.
It's a very brave omission too, and to have the voice of your 27-year-old self merge with the narrative as we've been reading it. It's a tremendous effect when it happens, and those who have read it will have that experience, and those who haven't, it's something to look forward to. You mentioned the people who've left El Salvador.
Yeah.
500,000 people left the country.
Right.
Many of them came here. Father David Hollenbach is especially adept in explaining some of those circumstances and what the situation in El Salvador at that moment, how it, it's not just echoes, but many of its effects are being replicated in our time and at our border. David, would you join us on stage now? And I just invite the two of you to bring the story up to the present.
I'm really happy to see you again.
Happy to see you too. Thank you. Well, two things I would say just in immediate response. One is I want to thank Carolyn for this extraordinarily moving book, which captures the situation in El Salvador in the years that you were there, the time you were there, in an extraordinarily vivid, concrete, illuminating way. I knew Ignacio Ecuria a bit. We worked together on a project on human rights that was conducted here at Georgetown. And I could only say that he's probably the most passionate intellectual I've ever met, because he was both extremely passionate and extremely intellectual, as you have said. And your book explained to me, or portrayed to me, where the passion that he felt was coming from, because he knew what the reality of the people was all about. In terms of Paul's question about the situation today, sad to say, although the United States spent huge quantities of money funding the Salvadoran military, when the Civil War ended and the Moakley Commission finished its report, and the UN Commission on Human Rights finished its report, the US pulled out, military came home, and we basically just left people in the state that we had helped create there, where there was continuing poverty, continuing urgency for need of help. Many of them migrated to the United States as refugees. And then now we've been in the process of deporting them and sending them back. And that's creating part of the process of the deportation that's been taking place, is that we have been managed to deport gang conflict from Los Angeles to El Salvador, to San Salvador. The conflict that's going on there today, that's producing huge migrations to this country, is in some way an inheritance of the war that you described, or of the death squad situation you described, and the war that followed it, and of what we did when we sent all these people back from the United States, and they took conflicts with them. And we're taking away, or our government now wants to take away temporary protected status from the Salvadorans who are in this country now and send more of them back, which could send more conflict back.
200,000 people.
Yeah, send more conflict back to El Salvador. So the story is not over. And the reason for both serious passion about the needs of the people there and serious intellectual analysis of what needs to be done has not ended. And we need that right today, too, I think.
I'm really happy you brought up the refugees. I consider the families at the border who came in the so-called caravans, they're not migrants. They're refugees of war, that war that was 12 years long, and its aftermath, as you described.
The murder rate in El Salvador is the highest in the world.
Yes, now. And they suffer from extortion, kidnapping, violent death, torture. That's what they're running away from. And they're so fearful that anything they can imagine happening during their journey to the U.S. or when they reach the U.S. cannot possibly be as bad as what is behind them. So they're terrified. And our response has been horrible. And we owe I think we have a grave responsibility towards Central Americans. And as I tried to explain to people, if every single man, woman, and child in Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador all came here as a thought experiment, which would never happen, the population of the United States would increase by 9%. It is not a crisis for the United States. It is a crisis for them. That they are the ones who are in crisis, not us. We do not have an immigration problem. We have an ethical, moral problem.
I think your portrayal of the reality that you describe in the book in such vivid ways can help us understand not only what happened when you were there, but can help us understand to some degree what is happening there now. And so, despite the fact that we are no longer involved in Salvador the way we were militarily, we are deeply engaged morally with what's going on there now.
You mentioned younger readers, Carolyn, and I think many, many people were educated about what was happening in El Salvador, younger people through the country between us. And so the thought that this book would now do the same for another generation that's seeing a different manifestation of the same problems, it's a very powerful thought. So let's hope that good things happen later in the week in New York, and the book goes on to have that life with younger readers.
I can't think. I feel Leonel here somewhere. He's very mischievous, always has been. He's up to something. That's what it is, yeah. And
There must be questions from the audience. Yes.
Quite a question. Beautiful witness to Leonel. I'm John Chatino. I teach Latin American history here at Georgetown.
at last we meet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Carol and I communicated a while back.
Yeah.
And when I was a very young, not so young, faculty member at Carleton and St. Olaf Colleges in Minnesota in 1985, Leonel came to a big regional conference on the crisis in Central America. It was laden with diplomats, journalists, scholars, etc. But and he was among those invited to speak about the crisis in El Salvador. But the highlight of the event was a large young man from El Salvador raised up and, kind of like me, asked for the microphone. And he started to tell the story that he had been dragged into the military in El Salvador. And he had been sent out to kill family and friend. And he was watching his own allies being forced to kill people who were his family and friend. And this young man, whose name I have totally forgotten, I'm sadly say, just started to shake and break totally. He couldn't carry on. Leonel Gomez left the stage, walked down to the audience, put his arm around this young man who had been in Minnesota working on a farm for a couple of years and was just learning English. Leonel put his arm around this young man and said, "I'm with you. Keep talking, and if you need be, I'll translate for you." And he enabled this young man to share his story about living and dying at the center of life and death in El Salvador. And I want to say all the famous journalists, authors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, became second-rank humans. And I had heard of Leonel Gomez previously because he shows up in academic studies, et cetera, et cetera. But I discovered him as this amazingly powerful, caring, facilitating human. So I just want to add that to this conversation.
I want to add that Georgetown really helped Monsignor Romero with an honorary degree and probably bought him 2 years of life in so doing, and that Leonel knew Father Elie. They spent, my husband is here in the audience, and he was there in El Salvador as well, and he's in the book as well. And we were married here at Dahlgren Chapel 35 years ago, and Father Elie and Leonel spent the whole wedding reception just talking. So, completely engaged with each other. And so, I want to thank Georgetown University for that, for their support of Monsignor Romero, and, and the friendship to Leonel, too, was really important.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Rose Berger from Sojourners
Yes.
Magazine,
Oh.
which thank you. Rose Berger from Sojourners Magazine, and we've known Carolyn for a long time and worked with you in the past. I'm wondering, you mentioned this a little bit, but I'm wondering about the impact of such trauma at such an early age on your voice as a writer. I mean, clearly you have made you were able to write poetry out of the midst of some of that horror. But there's another kind of voice that comes up in the memoir that I think I sometimes see writers never get back to that voice after having been through direct traumatic experiences. And I just wonder if you have any reflections on that.
I'll just say that when I first came back from El Salvador, I was quite driven to speak, and I had a poetry book published, and all of a sudden, because of 2 newspaper columnists, I got invitations, as Monsignor predicted. He said, "You're going to speak in the US, you just have to be prepared." But I got invitations to colleges and churches and synagogues and all over. I went to 49 states. I didn't think I was traumatized. I thought everyone else was traumatized, and that what we had to do was stop American military intervention, cut back the aid, help Americans to understand that the origins of this war were in oppression and poverty. Well, it was a long time before I registered at all that I had been profoundly changed by that experience and that I wasn't the same person. I knew I had become boring to people because I was talking about this all the time. And I would see the eyes, kind of at dinner parties and things. Here she goes, we're going to hear about El Salvador all night. I understood that I had become somewhat obsessive, but I didn't admit to any profound change. I didn't realize that when you cross that bridge, when you make that kind of journey, you don't get to come back. Someone else comes back who's not you. So when I started trying to recreate myself at that age, I realized what had happened. In the writing of this, I realized what had happened. And my theory about trauma is there's one thing that really helps it, more than medications, more than anything else, and that's work on behalf of suffering people who are adjacent somehow to the trauma. So, for example, I know some Vietnam veterans who came back severely PTSD trauma, and they made a work of providing prosthetics, arms and legs to Vietnam after the war, before relations were established between the 2 countries. And they went forward in their lives with surviving the PTSD by doing this kind of work. And I mean, there are many, many examples, but for me, I think what saved me was talking and going around the country and trying to build the sanctuary movement and the Witness for Peace movement and the, various solidarity movements. I tried to not to be member of any of this because I wanted to be, a different kind of voice. And Leonel had also said, you're a poet, you be a poet, You don't have to be an activist, you don't have to be a journalist, just be a poet, But then I had to reconceive what it meant to be a poet, and to have a voice to bring it through poetry. So I would only say that if people are traumatized, try some kind of really intense work, volunteer, not whatever it is, something that you do, it helps.
We have time for one more question over there.
Just one more, okay. Sit.
I was one of those audience members at one of your poetry stops. I was 20 years old, Minnesota, Mankato State, probably 1980 something.
Michele Robins.
Part of the Prairie Women's, and I was an undergrad, major in English and women's studies, because when English departments were too conservative and crazy making, I'd go to women's studies, and when that was too crazy making, I'd go back to English, and double majored. And I've been a huge fan ever since then. I went to Latin America, I learned Spanish. I think the ripple effect that can be felt in this room and felt around the country and the world, quite frankly, and definitely in the Americas, is not to be underestimated. And I hope that you get hundreds and hundreds of these testimonials like mine, And I hope that I've done something with the work that I've done and that I do every day, teaching English as a second language to people who come to the U.S. and who want to come to the U.S. and who want to leave the U.S. or whatever, right? Whatever the relationship is. I just really want you to know that, and to know that probably, everyone, whether they've only read the book, over the summer or whatever it might be, those ripples are going to continue to go on and on and on and on.
Thank you. Are you teaching English as a foreign language here in the city?
I'm teaching at Georgetown Law to foreign-trained lawyers from all over the world, and I've taught in the trenches with the undocumented population and everyone in between. And I say now that I teach the lawyers who I hope represent my former students that I taught, who were...
What is your name?
Michele.
Michele, thank you so much for this,
Very
and for
nice.
your work.
Thank you. Thank you.
And for being at Georgetown. Okay.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, David. Thank you, President Gioia, and everyone else who took part.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to be with you.
I'm so glad you're here.